it seems like in World War II, the way people were acting was even worse than they were acting in World War I. The way like Germany and Russia were fighting in World War I was probably more civil than how they were fighting in World War II. And then obviously what Japan was doing in China at the time. What was going on around the world that people just got so like demonic during this period?
No, it's not. Warfare's not civil. You're killing people. I love people talk about just wars, and it's rather a horrible piece of human existence. So there are a number of things have gone on with the Industrial Revolution. You can now kill people on an industrial scale. When you're doing it with bows and arrows, it takes a lot more time to create the mayhem. So that's one thing, the ability just to wipe out people. World War I on the Western Front was all entrenched. On the Eastern Front, there was a great deal of movement, but on the Western Front, it was entrenched, which meant civilian populations weren't really touched by it. Right? Where the initial fighting, yeah, they're leveled. But once you get a trench, you're not. And then we in the West don't actually study too much what happened to the civilians on the Eastern Front where it's moving around. This is back to my half-court tennis. So we're not paying attention to those civilians. So for the West, very few civilian casualties. Whereas when you get to World War II, you're bombing people. You know, technologies you can get at people and invading. Also, it's the lesson of World War I, the feeling that the Germans really hadn't felt their defeat, and that allowed them to make up this story about how it was they weren't defeated, the Jews did it, or whoever, they were betrayed. And Churchill and Roosevelt decided there would be a march to Berlin to disabuse them of that. And that involves killing a lot of civilians to get to Berlin. And of course, the Russians were determined to pay back for what the Nazis had done to them. And we had no sympathy for what we weren't going to, we're going to turn a blind eye at what the Russians were up to because the Nazis had been so heinous.
This is probably wrong. I want you to correct me, but maybe one way you can explain why the Japanese were so brutal in their campaign around this time is if you think that when you lose, you have this idea that you have social death, it's better to kill yourself than go back to your family and say, I surrendered. Maybe they just applied, this is their failure to empathize with or think it from the perspective of their enemy, but they were just thinking like, listen, if we lost, we would commit seppuku. When they lose, they forfeit human rights, and in some sense, like they was just like applying the principle of social death to their enemy.
Uh, the whole war is brutal. So we they're doing a lot of hand-to-hand brutality, and part of it has to do with lack of equipment. That firebombing of Tokyo happened in one night. I think it's 80,000 Japanese are incinerated. Okay, let's talk about brutality. Now, the reason why Americans did that is because they knew the alternative was sending American kids onto Japan who would die doing that. And so the decision was it was better to kill a lot of Japanese civilians than it was to kill American soldiers. And that's also the reason that went into the atomic bombing. That's controversial, right? The Americans, why did they drop atomic bombs on the Japanese? And there was no disagreement about that in the United States at the time because it was a question of, are you going to send American young men your age, and millions of them would have died hitting the home islands, or are you going to do the bombing? And of course, the Americans did the bombing. So there's brutality all around in this war. Wars don't come up with clean hands.
Was there any way for the West or for America to win the Pacific War without the firebombing?
Well, okay, this is a whole other topic. Win in wars. What does win mean? For us, it was put Japan back in its box, right? But this is a whole problem for Japan. What's win? Or this country in Afghanistan, what's win? Is it booting Osama bin Laden out of Afghanistan? Once that happens, it's a day. Is it overthrowing the Taliban at a particular period? Or is it trying to turn the whole place into a democracy? Okay, those are all radically different things, but you need to make up your mind what it's going to be. I think it's a miracle. Okay. The win, if you're going to have the win be that the United States transforms Japan into a functional democracy or sets them on the road so that they will become them, if that's what the win is, no. Because if you don't I showed you the 3 horrible events in 4 days. That's quite incredible to have that much bad news happening in a half a week. And that absolutely shattered the Japanese, and it also opened the door for those who thought they were in crazy land to capitulate. If you don't do that, okay, we invade the home islands. Americans were sick of the war, and you start losing lots of American kids in Japan. I think at some stage we decide to pull them out of Japan and blockade them eternally. And then you've got, I don't know, Japan is like a new North Korea, just this inevitable, these eternal, non-functioning society. So no. These wars are tragic. And also, don't think that you have all the cards, that you're going to make the decisions about what's going to happen. The other side's going to put you into corners where you're going to choose from very unpleasant alternatives.